Right now at 10.
Part of me want to rip his head off, and part of me just, I don't know if I care less for him.
6 months after the shock and horror inside the Aurora Theater, prosecutors spell out their case against the suspect as victims and survivors line up demanding justice.
As long as it doesn't see the light of day again, it doesn't really much concern me.
Now, new emotional stories of heroism from that July night are emerging. 7 News Now with team coverage of the theater shooting, seeking justice. From testimony in court, it's clear the emotion and shock from what happened in the Aurora Theater is still raw. Even for police officers today, they relive that horrific night. Our team coverage begins tonight with 7 News reporter Marshall Zellinger, who's live from the Arapahoe County Courthouse. And Marshall, we learned today James Holmes was planning to attend this showing nearly 2 weeks in advance.
Aurora officer Jason Oviatt, the first witness on the stand, is the man who arrested James Holmes. Oviatt arrived behind the theater and saw a man he first thought was a cop wearing a helmet and gas mask. Then Oviatt testified, quote, all of the police officers were moving urgently. He was just standing there. He held Holmes at gunpoint, who was, quote, completely compliant. Another officer testified he parked near the front of the theater and ran through an adjacent theater to get to the back of the building. He said he asked Holmes about his weapons. Holmes told him he had 4 guns and said he didn't have any bombs at the theater, but he had improvised explosive devices at his apartment and they would go off if officers tripped them. The officer said Holmes volunteered that information without being asked. The officer said he cut off Holmes's armor and stripped him down to his underwear. A third officer, Justin Grizzle, asked Holmes if anyone was helping him. He testified Holmes just looked at him and smiled, kind of like a smirk. When Grizzle entered the theater, he said he nearly slipped on all of the blood inside the back door. He used his squad car to make 4 trips to the hospital, taking 6 victims. Inside the 415-seat theater, this Aurora detective testified he found 224 unused bullets. Using a blown-up photo showing the seats of the theater, the detective marked exactly where the 10 victims inside were found. 2 other victims died at the hospital, Jessica Gawi and Veronica Mosier-Sullivan. What I'm holding here is a chart basically of what we heard in testimony where it left off today, describing the injuries of each victim who was killed and a handful of those that were injured, also where they were in the theater. That is where testimony will pick up tomorrow morning at 9:30. One other bit of news we learned in court today is that James Holmes bought his ticket to see Batman on July 8th. Reporting live, Marshall Zellinger, 7 News.
Family members of victims and survivors were among those in the courtroom today listening to the graphic testimony. And among them was Sam Sudani, whose daughter was seriously injured in the shooting. Here is his description of the experience in his own words.
I don't feel hate or anger toward him. I just don't feel anything toward him. I really don't. It's hard to explain. I was crying like everybody else. I couldn't keep. I'm gonna cry now. It's really hard talking about that pretty girl, that 7-year-old. I don't know. It just really is heartbreaking.
And in court today, we got powerful new insight into the hellish scene Aurora officers and first responders rushed to, including emotional testimony from officers who recounted the efforts of trying to save lives that night. Recalling the horrific night of the theater shooting was enough to make 2 veteran Aurora police officers break down on the stand. Officer Justin Grizzle, a former paramedic, described the scene inside Theater 9. While remembering seeing bodies lying motionless on the floor, he said, quote, I knew I needed to get them to the hospital now. Tearing up, he then said, I didn't want anyone else to die. A police sergeant needed a moment to compose himself while talking about discovering 6-year-old Veronica Mosier-Sullivan, the shooting's youngest victim, and finding out she didn't have a pulse. Then there are the stories of officers springing into action, taking victims to the hospital in their own patrol cars. An officer remembered taking shooting survivor Caleb Medley, who he recalled was making a, quote, god-awful gurgling sound. The officer testifying he shouted in the car at Medley, don't die on me.
In and for the 18th Judicial District.
In and for the 18th Judicial District.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And that is George Brockler, the new DA, whose office is leading the prosecution in the theater shooting case. He was sitting in the courtroom all day and then, after the hearing adjourned, was sworn in as the DA for the 18th Judicial District. That district includes Arapahoe, Douglas, Elbert, and Lincoln counties. He also announced Mark Hurlbert, the former DA in Summit and Eagle counties who prosecuted the Kobe Bryant case, will become the assistant DA. Now, these were the lines courtroom observers stood in today. No doubt an emotional experience. But as Call 7 investigator John Ferrugia tells us, it's a very necessary step for victims and survivors. So, John, this preliminary hearing, why is it so important to both the prosecution and defense?
Well, it gives the prosecution the opportunity to lay out the key points of its case against James Holmes, and that case is overwhelming. There are going to be many witnesses and emotional testimony that will make it absolutely clear that Holmes is responsible for these killings. This also gives the defense the opportunity to see the outline of the prosecution's case and time to consider what the best option might be for Holmes, clearly, and he's got very few options here.
So do you think this will actually go to trial?
Well, the prosecution has a decision to make. Will it accept life in prison without parole for Holmes in lieu of a trial? Or will the prosecutor offer no deal and take Holmes to trial simply to try to get the death penalty? Now, the defense has signaled it will make an insanity plea, and that's a difficult defense to prove to a jury. But if successful, it would still mean that Holmes is locked up for the rest of his life. The other question, does the prosecutor want to put victims and officers through an extended and emotional trial to try to get the death penalty? The new DA, George Brockler, will likely have conversations with victims' families before making any final decision.
Stay with 7 News for continuing coverage of the theater shooting court proceedings on air and online. Follow our tweets and Facebook posts for accounts of what's happening in the courtroom. And our web team is blogging about it all on our website. You can also read and pay tribute to the victims there as well, all at thedenverchannel.com.